James had never expected his diplomatic mission to take such a strange turn. He was a seasoned diplomat, sent to a distant alien planet to negotiate peace between Earth and that Axiran species. The planet, Vestra, was known for its vast landscapes and advanced technology, but little did James know that this mission would be unlike any he had faced before. As the transport ship landed, James stepped out, adjusting his uniform and trying to prepare for the meeting ahead. His heart raced, not from fear, but from curiosity. That Axiran species were powerful, known for their military might and strong traditions. This was his chance to forge a lasting peace, something he had been trained for all his life. But nothing could have prepared him for what awaited him in the royal palace. The palace was a towering structure of glass and stone, with high ceilings and intricate carvings. James was ushered through halls lined with guards, their eyes cold and watchful. The air felt different here, thick with tension and unspoken expectations. It was during one of the official banquets that James first saw her, the princess. Princess Villara. She was everything James had imagined a princess would be. Tall, regal, and commanding. Her long silver hair cascaded down her back, her sharp features framed by an aura of authority. She was beautiful, but there was something else in her eyes. A hint of sadness, a flicker of rebellion. As the evening wore on, James found himself standing near the princess, caught in a conversation with other diplomats. But then, without warning, Villara stepped closer to him. Her gaze met his, and James felt a shiver run down his spine. There was something intense in her eyes, something that made him forget the formalities of the evening. "I need your help," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, but clear enough for James to hear. James blinked, unsure if he had heard correctly. "What do you mean?" he asked, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. Villara glanced over her shoulder and motioned for him to follow her. He hesitated for only a moment before deciding to go with her. Something in her tone told him this was important. She led him down a narrow corridor, away from the crowd, until they reached a small private chamber. The doors closed behind them with a soft hiss, and for the first time that evening, James felt a sense of privacy. Villara turned to face him, her expression a mix of determination and vulnerability. "I have a request," she said, her voice steady but filled with urgency. "I need you to help me escape the life they want for me. Tonight." James furrowed his brow, confused. "Escape? What are you talking about?" Villara's gaze hardened for a moment, before softening again. "I am being forced into a marriage with a prince I do not love. It is a political arrangement to secure peace between our species, but I do not want it. I cannot live my life like this." James wasn't sure what to make of her words. A princess, desperate to escape an arranged marriage. It sounded like something from a story, not reality. But then Villara looked him in the eyes, and for a moment, James saw the raw sincerity there. She was not just a princess. She was a woman trapped in a situation she didn't choose. And at that moment, he found himself wanting to help her. "You will share the bed tonight, human," she said softly. "Not as a lover, but as my ally. I need to be seen as someone free, someone who can make their own choices. And you are my chance to escape." James didn't know what to say. This was beyond anything he had imagined, but he could see the desperation in Villara's eyes. The decision wasn't easy, but he found himself nodding. "I'll help you," he said quietly, knowing this would change everything. The following hours were filled with tension. James had agreed to help Princess Villara, but he had no idea what that truly meant. He had been trained for diplomacy, for negotiations, not for a situation like this. But there was something about the princess, the way she looked at him, the urgency in her voice, that made him believe in her cause. They were alone in the small chamber, the lights dim and the air heavy with anticipation. Villara paced back and forth, clearly deep in thought. James could sense her anxiety, her fear of the consequences. Being a princess meant she was always under the watchful eyes of her people, and any wrong move could destroy her future. James shifted uncomfortably, not sure how to start the conversation. He had always prided himself on being calm and collected in the face of pressure, but this was different. This was personal. This was more than just politics. Finally, Villara stopped pacing and faced him. Her silvery hair shimmered in the soft light, her face a mask of resolve. "Do you understand what I'm asking, human?" she asked, her voice steady, but tinged with uncertainty. "I need you to be seen with me, to pretend we are more than just allies. I need to be free, to choose my own destiny. You're the only one who can help me." James took a deep breath, trying to process everything. He had been told countless times that his role was to facilitate peace between Earth and the tyrant species, but now, here he was, caught in a delicate situation with a princess who didn't want to be a political pawn. The stakes were higher than he had ever imagined. "You want me to pretend to be what? Your lover?" James asked, unsure of how to phrase the question. Villara's eyes darkened slightly, her expression hardening. "It's not about love, not yet. It's about control, about power. If I'm seen with you, with someone from Earth, I can prove that I am capable of making my own decisions, that I am not bound by the laws of my people." James nodded slowly, beginning to understand. The Xiran people were fierce and loyal, bound by their traditions. A royal marriage was seen as the ultimate duty, and Villara was being forced into one she didn't want. But with her being seen as a rebel, someone who defied expectations, perhaps she could change the course of her life. "I see," James replied quietly. "But how does this help you? Won't your people think this is just another political move?" Villara shook her head. "No, it won't. This will be different. I'll make it different. If they see us together, they will know that I am willing to take a stand, to make my own choices. I will no longer be a tool in their political games. I will be free." James could see the fire in her eyes, the determination that had been hidden beneath her royal demeanor. This was not a princess used to being told what to do. This was a woman who longed for something more, something beyond her station. And in that moment, James made a decision. He wasn't sure where this path would lead, but he couldn't turn back now. "If this is what you want," he said quietly, "I'll help you. I'll stand by you. But you need to understand, Villara, this could change everything. For both of us." She nodded, her eyes never leaving his. "I know," she whispered. "But sometimes you have to make the hardest choices in order to be free." The weight of her words hung in the air as they stood there in silence, knowing that tonight would mark the beginning of a new chapter in their lives. And as James looked into her determined gaze, he realized he wasn't just helping her escape a marriage. He was about to change the course of both their futures forever. The night had fallen, casting long shadows over the quiet palace. James sat in his room, his mind racing. He couldn't stop thinking about Princess Villara and her request. The idea of pretending to be involved with her, to take on the role of a lover, wasn't something he had ever expected. And yet, here he was, on the edge of something dangerous. The situation was delicate. He had seen the way Villara's people viewed their royalty, their fierce loyalty to tradition. If anyone found out that they were scheming, the consequences would be disastrous. His mission as an ambassador was to keep the peace, but now, it seemed he was caught in a much more personal battle, one that could change everything. James stood up and walked to the window, gazing out at the stars. He had been on Xiran for months now, working hard to establish relations with the alien species, to show them that Earth was not a threat. But now, the peaceful image he had worked so hard to maintain felt fragile. One wrong move, and it could all fall apart. But then, there was Villara. He thought of her, standing before him earlier that evening, her eyes full of fear and hope. The princess wasn't just another alien royal. She was determined to break free from the chains of her people's expectations. And James admired that. He had been trained to stay neutral, to avoid entangling himself in personal matters. Yet, as he thought about Villara's situation, He couldn't shake the feeling that helping her was the right thing to do. She wasn't asking for power or control. She was asking for freedom, a chance to live her own life. Just then, a soft knock on the door broke his thoughts. James turned quickly, surprised. He wasn't expecting anyone. He opened the door to find Villara standing there, her face serious but her eyes filled with a quiet plea. She was dressed in a flowing gown of shimmering blue, her silver hair falling around her shoulders like liquid light. There was no mistaking the strength in her posture, even as she seemed to hold herself back, unsure of what to say next. "James," she began, her voice soft but firm. "I need your help now. There's no turning back. You've already agreed to stand by me, and I can't do this without you." He looked at her, seeing the weight of the decision pressing on her, but also the resolve in her eyes. He nodded slowly. "I'm with you, Villara. You've made it clear that this is important, not just for you, but for both of us. But I need to know something. How far are we willing to go with this? This isn't just about helping you escape a forced marriage. It's about changing everything, for both of us." Villara stepped closer, her expression intense. "I know what's at stake, but I've thought about this for a long time. I can't live a lie anymore. And I won't be forced into a life I don't want. I trust you, James. You are the only one who has shown me kindness, the only one who has treated me like more than a political tool." James felt the weight of her words, the trust she was placing in him. It wasn't just about protecting her anymore. It was about protecting both their futures. "All right," he said quietly. "We move forward together, but we need to be careful. We can't let anyone find out what we're really doing, or everything will be ruined." Villara smiled, though it was faint. "I'm counting on you, human. Let's make sure they never see this coming." As they stood there in the dim light of the palace hallway, James realized that their plan, however risky, was the only chance they had. There was no turning back now. Their future, both his and Villara's, was tied to this dangerous game they had started, and the stakes were higher than either of them had imagined. The next few days passed in a blur of careful planning and quiet conversations. James and Villara knew they couldn't afford to make a single mistake. Their lives, and the fragile peace between Earth and the Exiran Empire, hung in the balance. As the stakes grew higher, the tension between them also began to shift, turning from uncertainty to a kind of quiet understanding. They spent their days separately, working to maintain their roles. James continued his work as an ambassador, meeting with Exiran officials and building the political ties needed to keep Earth's relationship with the Empire strong. Meanwhile, Villara appeared in public, playing the part of the perfect princess, graceful, composed, and distant. But privately, they exchanged messages and plans, meeting in the shadows, where no one could see them. Despite the danger, James couldn't help but notice how much Villara had changed in the short time they'd been working together. The strong-willed, determined woman who had once been so closed off and cold was now opening up to him, showing him the real Villara, the woman who had been trapped in a gilded cage all her life, desperate to break free. Late one evening, after a long day of meetings, James received a message from Villara. The message was simple, but it made his heart race. "Meet me in the garden tonight, after the moon rises. There's something we need to discuss." He didn't hesitate. The moment he saw the message, he knew this was a turning point in their plan. Tonight, things were going to change. He had to be ready for whatever came next. As he made his way to the garden, James felt a strange mixture of excitement and fear. He wasn't sure what Villara had planned, but he knew one thing for certain. Things were moving too fast to slow down now. Every moment they spent together, every secret they shared, made it harder to imagine walking away from this mission, from this connection. The garden was peaceful, bathed in the soft glow of the twin moons overhead. The scent of alien flowers filled the air, and the rustle of leaves in the wind was the only sound that broke the stillness. James stood there for a moment, taking in the beauty of the place, before he saw her, Velara, standing at the center of the garden, her silver hair shining in the moonlight. She was waiting for him, her figure outlined against the night sky. "James," she said softly as he approached. "You came." He smiled, his heart beating faster as he stepped closer to her. "Of course. You said you had something important to discuss. I'm here." Velara hesitated for a moment, her eyes flickering with uncertainty. "I know what we're doing is dangerous, and I know what's at stake for both of us. But I can't keep pretending anymore. The future of my people, my life, depends on us. But I also—" She paused, taking a deep breath. "I need to be honest with you. This isn't just about escaping a marriage. It's about my freedom. But it's also about something more. Something I didn't expect to feel." James tilted his head, his curiosity piqued. "What do you mean?" She stepped closer, her eyes locking with his. "I've been afraid to admit it, but the truth is, I care about you, James. More than I ever thought I could. You've shown me something I never thought I'd experience. Trust, kindness, and yes, even love. I never wanted to be vulnerable, but I don't know how to feel about this connection between us." The words hung in the air, heavy and uncertain. James felt a rush of emotions, surprise, warmth, and something deeper that he hadn't expected. He had never imagined that his mission would lead to this, being caught in a complex web of duty, politics, and unexpected feelings. "Velara," he said, his voice steady but soft. "I care about you too. I didn't expect this either, but it's clear now that we're in this together. Whatever happens next, we'll face it side by side." The silence between them deepened, and for a moment, it felt like time stood still. They were two people from different worlds, bound together by something more powerful than duty. Velara finally broke the silence, her voice barely above a whisper. "Then let's face it together. Whatever happens next, we'll make our own fate." James nodded, feeling the weight of her words. There was no turning back now. Their bond had grown stronger, and with it, the risks had only increased. But for the first time in weeks, James felt like they had a chance, not just to escape their troubles, but to shape their own future. The days after their conversation in the garden felt like a whirlwind. James and Velara could no longer deny the growing bond between them. It was something deeper than just duty or survival. It was connection, something neither had anticipated when they first met. But in the midst of the tension and uncertainty, there was an undeniable spark, one that pulled them closer with every passing moment. As they continued their secret meetings, James could feel the weight of the choices ahead of them. The time for planning was quickly running out. Soon, Velara would be forced into her marriage, and their mission would take a dangerous turn. There was no more room for hesitation. They spent their days carefully pretending nothing had changed, heaping up appearances for the sake of the empire. James attended meetings with the Xiren officials, his thoughts always drifting back to Velara. Meanwhile, she carried on with her royal duties, playing the perfect princess. But her mind was always on the future. In one of their late-night meetings, as the stars glimmered above them, Velara's voice was soft, almost as if she was afraid to speak her thoughts aloud. "I've been thinking about what happens next," she said, her voice tinged with uncertainty. "If we're going to escape this marriage, we can't wait much longer. They'll never let me go. You'll have to act quickly if we want a chance." James nodded, his heart racing as he considered the consequences. They both knew that if they didn't act soon, it would be too late. "I understand. I'll make sure we're ready. We'll leave when the time is right." But there was one question hanging in the air that neither of them wanted to address. What would their lives be like after they escaped? Velara had known nothing but royal obligations and control, while James had a home, a family, and a life on Earth. Could they truly find a place for themselves in a universe that had never been kind to those who defied the norm? The question seemed to linger between them, but neither wanted to give voice to the fear that had begun to take root. Later that evening, as they prepared for another quiet night apart, Valera stopped James before he could leave. Her expression was more serious than usual. "I need to tell you something," she said, looking into his eyes. "I know I've asked for your help with my escape, but I need you to understand. I'm not just asking because I have no other choice. I'm asking because I trust you, more than I've ever trusted anyone in my life." James felt a warmth spread through him at her words. The sincerity in her voice touched him deeply. He stepped closer, reaching out to take her hand. "I trust you too, Valera. Whatever happens next, we'll face it together. You're not alone in this." For a moment, they stood there, hand in hand, the silence around them more comforting than anything they had felt before. They had already crossed so many lines, taken so many risks. But in this moment, it felt like the world outside their secret meetings didn't matter. All that mattered was them, and the bond they were beginning to forge. The future was uncertain. But for the first time, James didn't feel afraid. Whatever came next, they would face it together. There would be no turning back. They were in this to the end. And as the night wore on, with the Siren Palace looming in the distance, James knew one thing for sure. They had just begun their most important journey yet. The days felt like they were slipping away faster than ever. Every moment seemed to carry more weight. Every glance exchanged more meaning. James and Valera knew they were running out of time, but neither of them could stop thinking about the risks involved. The walls of the Siren Palace seemed to close in around them, the impending marriage ceremony drawing near. James had been working with his contact on the inside, trying to secure a way out, but the more they planned, the more the danger grew. The palace was heavily guarded, and escaping without detection seemed nearly impossible. Every step they took was a risk, but they both knew there was no turning back now. One evening, after a long day of pretending nothing was amiss, Valera sought James out. The tension between them had been building for days, and she needed to speak with him. She found him in a quiet corner of the palace garden, away from the watchful eyes of the guards. "James," she said softly, her voice laced with uncertainty, "we need to be sure this is the right thing. I can't keep living like this. My whole life has been planned for me. Marriage, duty, responsibilities. I don't know what's out there for me, but I do know that staying here isn't the answer." James turned to her, his face filled with determination. "I know it's not easy, but we can't keep pretending forever. We have to leave, together. You deserve more than this life. You deserve to choose your own path, and I'll be there with you, no matter what it takes." Valera's heart raced as she listened to him. She had never heard such conviction in his voice. It was a relief, a small spark of hope in the midst of the chaos they were both caught in. But even with that hope, there was still the question of how they would actually escape. "What's the plan?" Valera asked, her voice steady, though her heart was full of doubt. James hesitated for a moment, his mind working through the possibilities. "We'll need to move quickly. There's a hidden passage that leads out of the palace. It's rarely used, and we can only access it at night when the guards are changing shifts. Once we're outside, we'll make our way to the transport station, and from there, we'll leave the planet." Valera's eyes widened with concern. "And if we're caught?" "If we're caught, we have to be ready for anything," James replied. "But I believe we can do it. We've come this far, and there's no turning back now." Valera nodded slowly, her mind racing. She had never thought she'd be in this position, fleeing from everything she knew, with nothing but trust and the unknown ahead of her. But now, standing beside James, she realized that maybe the unknown was what she needed most. "I'm with you, James," she said, her voice firm. "Let's do it." The plan was set. Now it was just a matter of executing it without getting caught. They would have to be clever, swift, and silent. But in that moment, with Valera's words ringing in his ears, James knew that together they could overcome any obstacle that lay ahead. The night would be their chance, and they would take it. As they parted ways, both of them filled with determination, The uncertainty of the future still hung in the air. But they were no longer afraid. They had each other, and that was all they needed. The countdown to their escape had begun. The night was their only chance. The palace slept, or at least it seemed to. The grand halls, once filled with the sounds of laughter and music, were now eerily quiet. Villara and James had spent the entire day pretending that nothing was wrong, but inside, their hearts raced with anticipation. Tonight, they would make their move. The palace guards had a strict schedule, but it was during the changing of the guard that the hidden passage would be their only hope. James had memorized every step of the plan, and Villara had practiced moving quietly, her footsteps barely making a sound on the cold marble floors. They had no room for error. James met Villara in the garden as planned. The stars above them seemed to shine brighter tonight, as though they were watching over them. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest, but he pushed the fear aside. They had come too far to turn back now. "We can do this," he whispered, giving her a small nod. Villara's expression was calm, but there was an intensity in her eyes that James couldn't ignore. This was it, the moment they had been waiting for. They moved swiftly, sticking to the shadows, avoiding the guards who patrolled the hallways. James had found a way to disable some of the security systems temporarily, but they couldn't rely on that for long. Every step they took felt like it could be their last. The hidden passage was located near the back of the palace, behind a set of ornate double doors. They reached it just as the guards began their shift change. James gave Villara a signal to stay close and pressed his hand against the cool stone wall. A small section of the wall slid open, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into the darkness. Villara hesitated for a moment before stepping forward. The passage was cramped and smelled of dust and damp stone, but it was their only option. The sound of their footsteps echoed in the narrow corridor, but they moved as quickly as they could. They didn't speak. There was no need. Every step brought them closer to freedom. At the bottom of the stairs, they came to a large underground chamber. It was dark, but James had memorized the layout. He moved ahead cautiously, feeling his way through the maze of tunnels. They had only a few hours before the guards would realize they were missing, and by then, they needed to be far away from the palace. "Almost there," James whispered, his voice low. Villara nodded but didn't say a word. She knew the stakes. Every second mattered. Suddenly, a sound echoed in the distance, a faint footstep. James froze, motioning for Villara to do the same. The sound grew louder. Someone was coming. The guards. James's heart skipped a beat. They hadn't anticipated anyone else being in the tunnels. The shadows deepened around them, and they waited. The footsteps came closer, and for a moment, James thought they would be caught. He held his breath, his mind racing for a way out. But just as the footsteps reached them, they stopped. "Did you hear that?" a voice said, far too close for comfort. James's pulse raced. They couldn't be discovered now. They had no choice but to wait. Every muscle in his body tensed as they hid in the darkness, hoping that the guard would move on without noticing them. The tension hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Would they be caught, or could they escape? James held his breath, the future of their plan hanging on this single moment. The footsteps seemed to stretch on forever. James and Villara held their positions in the darkness, barely daring to breathe. The guard was so close now that James could hear his every step, each one more pronounced in the quiet of the tunnel. His heartbeat thudded in his ears, almost drowning out the sound of the guard approaching. Villara's hand tightened around his arm. He glanced at her, his eyes wide with tension. She looked back, her expression calm but intense, like a warrior preparing for battle. In that moment, they both understood the stakes. If they were discovered now, all would be lost. The escape would be over before it had even truly begun. The guard was almost upon them. James's mind raced. There had to be a way to get past without being noticed. His eyes scanned the tunnel for any possible escape route, but the narrow stone walls left little room for movement. There was nowhere to hide. But then, the guard stopped. James froze. The silence was unbearable. The guard was right there, just a few feet away. James could feel the heat of his breath on the cool air. But still, he didn't move. He could hear the guard's boots scraping lightly against the stone floor as he shifted his weight. Every second felt like an eternity. And then, finally, the guard turned and walked away. James exhaled in relief, his heart pounding in his chest. They had made it. For now. But it wasn't over. The tunnel was still dark and dangerous, and they still had a long way to go before they were out of the palace. The faint light of distant torches flickered from up ahead, marking the final stretch of their journey. They could do this. They had to. With one final glance to make sure the coast was clear, James motioned for Velara to follow. They crept forward, moving with quiet determination. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if the weight of their decision pressed down on their shoulders. They weren't just running from the palace. They were running from everything they knew, leaving behind everything they had once accepted as their world. The tunnel opened into another chamber, one James knew well. He had spent enough time exploring the palace's underground passages that he could navigate them with ease, but this was different. This time, he wasn't just escaping on his own. He was helping Velara, a princess of a powerful alien race, and everything had changed. Just a little further, James whispered, keeping his voice steady. Velara nodded silently, her eyes fixed ahead. The chamber was empty, but the heavy silence seemed to press in on them. They moved quickly, making their way toward the farthest wall where a metal door stood, slightly ajar. This was the final test. If they could get through this door, they would be free. If not, Velara stepped forward, her gaze unyielding. She placed her hand against the cold metal of the door and pushed. It creaked open slowly, revealing a narrow passage that led to the outside world. The stars above beckoned, their light shining through the gap. Freedom was just a few steps away. "After you," James said, his voice filled with hope. Velara didn't hesitate. She stepped into the passage first, and James followed closely behind. The door shut softly behind them, sealing off the world they had just left behind. The sound of their footsteps echoed in the narrow passage as they moved forward, their bodies tense with anticipation. They were close now. The end of their journey was near. They could feel it. The final test had just begun, but this time they would pass. Together. The cool night air hit James's face as he stepped into the open. For the first time in what felt like forever, he could breathe freely. The stars above were brighter than he had ever seen them, twinkling like diamonds in the velvet sky. The distant hum of the palace behind them was gone, replaced by the sound of crickets and the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze. They had made it. They were free. James glanced over at Velara, who stood beside him, her face soft with relief. Her usual commanding presence had faded, replaced by a quiet vulnerability. She was no longer a princess running from her duties. She was just a woman, standing in a world that was completely new to her. "You did it," James said quietly. "We did it." Velara looked up at him, her eyes reflecting the starlight. For a moment, there was only silence between them, filled with the weight of everything that had brought them here, everything they had been through. She reached out, her hand gently touching his arm. "I never thought this would be possible," she whispered. "When I first saw you, I thought you were just another human. But now, her voice trailed off, unsure of how to finish the thought. James could see the conflict in her eyes, the same conflict he had felt himself. He had never imagined that he would be standing here with Velara, a woman who was so different from him, yet so much the same. They had both been pushed to the edge of everything they knew, forced to make choices they never thought they would have to face. "It's okay," James said softly. "I never thought I would be here either. But we are. And we've made it." Velara nodded, her eyes meeting his with a strength that took him by surprise. "I didn't think I could trust anyone, especially a human. But you showed me something different." Something I didn't expect. James smiled gently, feeling the weight of her words. He had shown her a side of humanity that few would ever see. And in return, she had shown him the courage to stand up for what was right, even when it seemed impossible. Together, they had defied everything that had tried to tear them apart. Together, they had survived the unimaginable. Now, as the night stretched on, they stood at the beginning of something new. There were still many challenges ahead. Valera's past would not be so easily forgotten, and the galaxy was vast and unpredictable. But for now, in this moment, they were free. So, what now? James asked, breaking the silence. Valera's lips curled into a small smile. Now we make our own future. James nodded, feeling the weight of her words settle in his chest. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but he knew one thing for sure. They were in this together. And that was all that mattered. As they walked into the unknown, side by side, the stars above seemed to whisper promises of a new beginning.